In 1944, a soldier in Italy named Dudley Glover opened a package from home. Inside, two wool socks, carefully wrapped to survive the journey across the Atlantic, were two bottles of Coca-Cola. He and his friend John Glenn, not the astronaut, a different John Glenn, assigned to the 178th Field Artillery in Naples, stared at those two bottles like they were made of gold. They drank one immediately. They cherished every swallow. The other bottle they saved. Word got around. Other soldiers offered to buy it. The offers climbed. Glenn had an idea: auction the last bottle and give the money to the children of men in the battalion who had been killed in action. The bidding started. It kept going. When it was over, a single 6-ounce bottle of Coca-Cola had raised over $4,000. In 1944 money, roughly the annual salary of a factory worker back home. Coca-Cola headquarters heard about the auction and added another $2,000. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle, embedded with the unit, wrote about it. His conclusion: that one bottle of Coke was worth 80,000 bottles back home. This was not an isolated incident. It was not a marketing stunt. It was the expression of something that the American military establishment, from Eisenhower down to the newest private, understood instinctively. In a war fought 10,000 miles from home, across oceans and deserts and jungles, the things that connected a soldier to the country he was fighting for were not abstract. They were concrete. They were specific. They tasted like home. According to the American Scholar Journal, an unusually large number of soldiers wrote home that they were fighting, among other reasons, for the right to buy Coca-Cola. This sounds like advertising copy. It was not. These were real letters from real soldiers, written in foxholes and field hospitals and the holds of transport ships, and they said what every American in uniform already knew. Coca-Cola was not just a soft drink, it was a 6-ounce bottle of the United States of America. An Army officer stationed in Waco, Texas during the First World War had already understood this. Unless we have Coca-Cola, we will have to admit defeat at the hands of enemy heat and thirst. That was 1918. By 1943, the sentiment had intensified beyond anything that officer could have imagined. A bombardier in Italy, writing home via V-mail, the wartime microfilm letter system that reduced 37 mail bags into a single 45-pound sack, captured the feeling perfectly. Dear folks, you'll never guess what I had to drink this evening. Not whiskey, not gin, not Calvados, not beer, but good old-fashioned Coca-Cola in the bottle that's made to fit the hand. Just a few moments before we left our staging area to board the boat, Dick and I bought 2 Cokes and drank them to the next time we'd be drinking bottles of Cokes. That letter was written by a man about to ship out to combat. His last act before boarding the transport was to drink a Coca-Cola. His toast was not to victory or survival, but to the hope of drinking another Coke someday. And the story of how that bottle reached those soldiers on every front, in every theater, from North Africa to the Philippines to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, is one of the most remarkable logistics operations of the Second World War. It involved a presidential exemption from sugar rationing, a telegram from the Supreme Allied Commander, 64 bottling plants built in combat zones, 148 civilians in army uniforms, and, on the other side of the war, a German businessman who kept Coca-Cola's enemy factories alive by inventing a drink made from cheese waste and apple scraps, a drink that is still sold in every store on Earth today. In 1941, a few days after Pearl Harbor, the president of the Coca-Cola Company made a decision that would transform his company from an American soft drink brand into a global empire. Robert Winship Woodruff had led Coca-Cola since 1923. He was a Georgian, a sportsman, a personal friend of generals and politicians, including Dwight Eisenhower, with whom he regularly played golf. He was also a businessman who understood something fundamental about his product. Coca-Cola's value was not in the liquid, it was in the feeling. The taste of Coke was the taste of a drugstore counter on a summer afternoon, of a movie theater on a Saturday night, of normalcy and comfort and the easy pleasures of American life. For a soldier 10,000 miles from home, that taste was priceless. Woodruff issued an order that became legendary within the company. We will see that every man in uniform gets a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, wherever he is, and whatever it costs the company. 5 cents, the standard pre-war price of a Coke. Woodruff was guaranteeing that no soldier would pay a wartime premium, no matter what it cost Coca-Cola to produce and deliver the product to a foxhole in Tunisia or an airstrip on Guadalcanal. The logistics of honoring that promise would require the largest deployment of civilian industrial capacity into combat zones in American history. But Woodruff was not acting purely from patriotism. He was also acting from commercial instinct. Every soldier who drank Coca-Cola in North Africa would remember it when he came home. Every bottle consumed in Europe was a foothold in a market that Coca-Cola had barely penetrated before the war. The war was, as one company official later admitted with remarkable candor, the most remarkable promotional opportunity in the company's history. The government cooperated. In 1942, Coca-Cola was granted an exemption from sugar rationing when sold to the military or to retailers serving soldiers. President Roosevelt himself approved the dispensation. Sugar, one of the most tightly rationed commodities on the American home front, would flow freely to Coca-Cola's military production lines, while housewives were limited to 8 ounces per week. The justification was morale. Coca-Cola was officially classified as essential to the maintenance of troop morale, alongside cigarettes, mail, and letters from home. This was extraordinary. No other soft drink company received this treatment. Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola's main rival, was left to compete for rationed sugar on the civilian market. The exemption gave Coca-Cola an insurmountable wartime advantage that would last for decades. The sugar exemption was controversial, and it deserves examination. In 1942, the United States government imposed strict rationing on sugar, one of the first commodities to be rationed after Pearl Harbor. The War Ration Book limited each household to approximately 8 ounces of sugar per week, later reduced further. Housewives learned to bake without sugar, to preserve fruit without jam, to sweeten coffee with saccharin or honey. Sugar was needed for munitions. Industrial alcohol, a key ingredient in explosives manufacturing, was produced from sugarcane molasses. It was also needed for military rations. Every ounce consumed by civilians was an ounce unavailable to the war effort. Against this backdrop, the government's decision to exempt Coca-Cola from sugar rationing when sold to the military was remarkable. The justification was straightforward. The military classified Coca-Cola as a morale item, equivalent in psychological importance to tobacco, mail, and entertainment. The Army had studied the question and concluded that access to familiar consumer products, cigarettes, candy bars, and especially Coca-Cola, materially improved the fighting effectiveness of American troops by reducing homesickness, improving morale, and providing a brief sensory connection to civilian life. The exemption did not extend to civilian sales. Coca-Cola for domestic consumption was subject to the same sugar restrictions as every other product, but the military's allocation was enormous, enough to produce billions of bottles over the course of the war. Other soft drink companies, including Pepsi-Cola, received no comparable exemption. Pepsi's wartime advertising emphasized its larger 12-ounce bottle, twice the size of Coke's 6-ounce bottle, as a better value. But without the military contracts and sugar exemption, Pepsi could not match Coca-Cola's wartime penetration. The inequity was noted at the time, but rarely criticized publicly. In a war where civilians were melting their kitchen pots for aluminum, driving on retreaded tires, and accepting ration books for meat and gasoline, the idea that soldiers deserved their Coca-Cola was not controversial. The soldiers were dying. The least the country could do was send them a Coke. In June 1943, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in North Africa, the man planning the invasion of Sicily and eventually of France itself, took time from the most consequential military campaign in modern history to send a telegram about soda. The message requested 3 million bottles of Coca-Cola filled, plus complete bottling equipment capable of producing 20,000 bottles per day at each of 10 separate locations. He also requested sufficient syrup and bottle caps for 6 million refills. The telegram went to Coca-Cola's headquarters in Atlanta through official Army channels. It carried the weight of a Supreme Commander's requisition, not a request, but an order with military priority. The request was approved by Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall himself. When the Chief of Staff of the United States Army personally signs off on a soft drink order, you understand the scale of what Coca-Cola meant to the military. Eisenhower expected 10 portable bottling plants. Coca-Cola delivered 64. The first went operational in Oran, Algeria by Christmas 1943. From there, the network expanded across North Africa, into Italy, across France after D-Day, into Germany itself, and simultaneously across the Pacific Theater, Australia, the Philippines, Saipan, Okinawa. Eisenhower was not the only general who loved Coca-Cola. George Patton was a devoted fan, though he preferred his mixed with rum. Omar Bradley kept a case in his office wherever he went. Quartermasters at bases around the world lobbied for bottling equipment with the urgency of men requisitioning ammunition. Colonel John P. New, the quartermaster at an American base in Dutch Guiana, pleaded for a Coca-Cola bottling plant in early 1942, arguing that it was vital to the maintenance of contentment and well-being at his remote post. The military's embrace of Coca-Cola was total and unself-conscious. These were men who had grown up drinking it at drugstore counters and ball games and family picnics. They associated it with everything they were fighting to protect. A country where you could walk into any store, any gas station, any diner in any town from Maine to California and buy a Coca-Cola for 5 cents. That was the America they remembered. That was the America they intended to come home to. Pepsi-Cola's wartime experience was the mirror image of Coca-Cola's, and the consequences lasted for decades. Pepsi had been growing rapidly in the late 1930s, positioning itself as the value alternative to Coca-Cola. Its 12-ounce bottle, twice the size of Coke's 6-ounce, sold for the same nickel, and its advertising jingle was catchy and effective. By 1941, Pepsi was a genuine competitive threat. The war changed everything. Pepsi received no sugar exemption for military sales. It received no government contracts for overseas bottling plants. It received no technical observer positions for its employees. While Coca-Cola was building 64 bottling plants on government money across 3 continents, Pepsi was struggling to maintain domestic production under civilian sugar rationing. The disparity was not accidental. Robert Woodruff's personal relationships with Eisenhower, with military procurement officers, with the Roosevelt administration officials gave Coca-Cola access to the decision-making process that Pepsi could not match. Coca-Cola had been cultivating military relationships since the First World War, when an Army officer in Texas had written that the troops would have to admit defeat without their Cokes. By 1942, Coca-Cola was not just a preferred brand, it was an institutional partner of the American military. Pepsi survived the war, but the gap that the war opened in global distribution, in brand recognition, in the loyalty of an entire generation of veterans who had drunk Coca-Cola in every theater of the war, took Pepsi 20 years to begin closing. The Cola Wars of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, the Pepsi Challenge, the celebrity endorsements, the multi-billion-dollar advertising campaigns, were all attempts to overcome an advantage that Coca-Cola had secured, not through superior marketing, but through a war that had given it 64 free factories and the gratitude of 16 million soldiers. When those soldiers came home, they drank Coca-Cola. When they married and had children, they gave their children Coca-Cola. When they opened businesses, they installed Coca-Cola vending machines. The wartime generation's loyalty to the brand was not nostalgia, It was memory. It was the taste of the drink they had consumed in the worst moments of their lives, and that taste was inseparable from the relief of being alive to drink it. Coca-Cola's answer to Eisenhower's telegram and to the broader demand from 16 million American service personnel was one of the most unusual deployments of the war. The company sent 248 employees overseas to build and operate bottling plants in combat zones. 148 of these men were granted the official military status of technical observer, a designation normally reserved for civilian engineers whose expertise was essential to the war effort, such as those who maintained tanks or repaired aircraft. The technical observers wore Army uniforms, held officers' rank, received officers' pay, and carried identification patches marked TO. The soldiers called them Coca-Cola colonels. The colonels were not soldiers. They were bottling plant managers, mechanical engineers, syrup chemists, and logistics specialists. Their mission was to build Coca-Cola bottling plants as close to the front lines as military circumstances would permit, and to ensure that every American unit had access to Coca-Cola. 3 of them were killed in the line of duty. The logistics were staggering. 64 complete bottling plants were erected worldwide during the war, in North Africa, Italy, France, Germany, the Philippines, Saipan, and Okinawa. Wherever the American Army went, Coca-Cola followed. The soldiers on the line, who had not seen a bottle of Coke in months, welcomed the Coca-Cola colonels with a warmth that bordered on reverence. The colonels were deemed as vital to morale as the chaplains. The scale of Coca-Cola's wartime operation is best expressed in a single number: 5 billion. More than 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola were consumed by American military service personnel during the Second World War. This figure includes bottles from the 64 overseas plants, from domestic military installations, and from the countless mobile dispensing units deployed across every theater of operations. 5 billion bottles, in addition to uncounted servings from fountains, dispensers, and the 1,100 jungle units in the Pacific. To grasp the scale, 5 billion 6-ounce bottles laid end-to-end would circle the Earth more than 20 times. The production chain that made this possible began with sugar, procured under the presidential exemption from rationing, and the secret 7X flavoring concentrate shipped from Atlanta. The syrup was mixed with purified water and carbonated at each bottling location. Bottles were washed, filled, and capped on portable bottling lines that could be set up in a warehouse, a tent, or any structure with a concrete floor and a power supply. The Coca-Cola colonels supervised every step, maintaining the consistency of flavor that soldiers expected. A Coke in Oran had to taste exactly like a Coke in Omaha. This consistency was essential to the product's morale value. It was not just a sweet drink, it was a sensory connection to home, and any variation in taste would break the spell. Coca-Cola also launched The Red Barrel during the war, a company magazine tailored specifically for members of the armed services. It was a small publication, distributed through military channels, that combined light entertainment with news and advertisements. The Red Barrel served as another thread connecting soldiers to the civilian world they had left behind. Some copies survive today in collectors' markets and military archives. The company's wartime advertising campaign was among the most sophisticated of its era. Coca-Cola advertisements during the war did not emphasize the taste of the product or its ingredients. They emphasized belonging. Every advertisement showed American soldiers in North Africa, in the Pacific, in England, sharing a Coke with comrades, with Allied troops, with liberated civilians. The message was unmistakable. Coca-Cola was not selling a beverage, it was selling America itself, and the soldiers who carried that America to every corner of the globe were its ambassadors. The advertisements were blatantly patriotic, and they were effective precisely because they were true. Coca-Cola really was in every theater. Soldiers really did drink it in foxholes and field hospitals. The advertising was not creating a narrative, it was documenting one that already existed. Even the Soviet Union was not immune. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the legendary commander who led the Red Army into Berlin, reportedly developed a taste for Coca-Cola during Allied conferences. But a Soviet marshal could not be seen drinking an American capitalist beverage. According to multiple accounts, Zhukov arranged for a special batch of colorless Coca-Cola to be produced, bottled in plain bottles with a white cap and a red star, so that it resembled vodka. The supreme commander of the Red Army was drinking Coca-Cola disguised as Russian spirits. The war also produced moments of transcendent absurdity. B-26 pilots based in the jungles of the South Pacific were so enthusiastic about their green camouflaged jungle fountain that the Army put in an urgent request for 100 more. Military transport aircraft flew empty Coca-Cola bottles back to bottling facilities to be refilled, like empty shell casings returned for reloading. The bottles were heavy, fragile, and took up cargo space on aircraft that could have carried ammunition or medical supplies. The Army treated them as a logistics priority anyway, because the alternative, soldiers without Coca-Cola, was considered a greater threat to combat effectiveness than the loss of cargo space. While Coca-Cola was building bottling plants behind Allied lines, something very different was happening in Germany. Coca-Cola Deutschland, the company's German subsidiary, had been one of Coca-Cola's great pre-war successes. Under the leadership of Max Keith, a German-born businessman who had taken over the subsidiary in 1933, sales had exploded from 100,000 crates per year to 4.5 million by 1939. Keith was a formidable figure, tall, intimidating, with a small whisk-broom mustache and an absolute, almost fanatical devotion to the Coca-Cola brand. He valued his allegiance to the company above his allegiance to his country. When America entered the war on December 7, 1941, communication between Atlanta and the German subsidiary was severed immediately. The supply of Coca-Cola's secret 7X flavoring syrup, which could only be produced in Atlanta, was cut off. Keith could no longer make Coca-Cola. And as the head of an American-owned company in Nazi Germany, he was in personal danger. The German government was threatening to seize enemy-owned businesses. General Motors had already pulled out of Germany. IBM's operations had been confiscated. Keith chose a different path. He would not surrender the company. He would not close the factories. He would keep the plants running and protect his workers' jobs. But to do that, he needed a product to sell. He gathered his chemists and gave them an impossible brief: create a new soft drink using only ingredients available in wartime Germany. No Coca-Cola syrup, no imported sugar, no tropical fruits, only what Germany could produce domestically. The chemists went to work. What they produced was, by any modern standard, bizarre. The primary ingredients were whey, the liquid byproduct of cheese production normally discarded, and apple pomace, the fibrous residue left after pressing apples for cider. Beet sugar provided sweetness. The drink was yellowish, vaguely fruity, and its taste varied from batch to batch depending on which ingredients were available. It bore no resemblance whatsoever to Coca-Cola. Keith needed a name. He told his salesmen to let their fantasy run wild, fantasy being the German word for imagination. A veteran salesman named Joe Knipp immediately blurted out, "Fanta." The name stuck. Fanta went into production in 1940. By 1943, it was selling 3 million cases per year in Germany. German housewives, coping with severe sugar rationing, used it as a sweetener in soups and stews. It became a fixture of wartime German life, a small, fizzy piece of normalcy in a country being steadily bombed into rubble. Throughout the war, Coca-Cola executives in Atlanta did not know whether Keith was working for the company or for the Nazis. Communication was impossible. They could only hope. After the war, an investigation commissioned by Coca-Cola found that Keith had never joined the Nazi Party despite repeated pressure to do so. He had not enriched himself. He could have registered Fanta under his own name and built a personal fortune. Instead, he preserved every asset, every factory, every employee, and every trademark for the parent company. When American forces entered Germany in 1945, Keith handed the entire operation, including the Fanta brand and all accumulated profits, back to Coca-Cola headquarters in Atlanta. His reward was the company's gratitude and the continuation of his career. Fanta was discontinued in 1949, but relaunched in Italy in 1955 with an orange-flavored formula that bore no resemblance to the wartime original. Coca-Cola purchased the brand in 1960 and distributed it worldwide. Today, Fanta is sold in over 190 countries in more than 200 flavors. Every bottle traces its origin to a German factory in 1940, where a man loyal to an American company made a drink out of cheese waste and apple scraps because it was the only way to keep the lights on. In 2015, Coca-Cola released a 75th anniversary version of Fanta in Germany, packaged in glass bottles evoking the original design with an authentic wartime flavor including 30% whey and apple pomace. An accompanying television advertisement invited consumers to celebrate and remember the good old times. The backlash was immediate and severe. Critics pointed out that the good old times being celebrated were the years of Nazi rule. The advertisement was pulled. The episode illustrated how deeply the wartime origin of Fanta remains embedded in the product's history and how uncomfortable that history remains even 80 years later. The irony is that Fanta exists because of the same war that made Coca-Cola a global brand. The embargo that created Fanta in Germany was the same war that allowed Coca-Cola to build 64 bottling plants on government money and establish itself on every continent. Both sides of the Coca-Cola story, the soldier's drink and the enemy's substitute, were products of the same conflict, and both are still sold side by side in the same stores, in the same vending machines, all over the world. When the fighting ended, few companies in the world were as well positioned as Coca-Cola for post-war expansion. The United States military had bankrolled the construction of 64 bottling plants in countries where Coca-Cola had never operated. The plants had been built with government money, maintained with government supplies, and operated by Coca-Cola employees wearing Army uniforms. When the war ended, these plants did not close. They kept running for another 3 years under military contracts before transitioning to civilian operation. By the time the transition was complete, Coca-Cola had established a functioning bottling infrastructure on every continent except Antarctica. The company that had entered the war as a primarily American brand emerged from it as a global empire. As one company official observed, the war had ensured the worldwide acceptance of Coca-Cola. Before the war, Coca-Cola was bottled in 44 countries. After the war, the number was dramatically higher, and every new market had been opened not by salesmen but by soldiers. Young Americans who drank Coca-Cola in North Africa and Italy and France and the Philippines and Japan, and who left behind a taste for the product that outlasted the military occupation. There is a detail that captures the breadth of Coca-Cola's wartime reach more vividly than any production number. In American prisoner of war camps holding German prisoners, the United States government included a bottle of Coca-Cola in every prisoner's rations. The decision was deliberate, a demonstration of American abundance and generosity, even toward the enemy. German soldiers who had spent years drinking Fanta made from cheese whey and apple scraps now tasted the original product. Some of those German prisoners returned home after the war with a taste for Coca-Cola that they carried for the rest of their lives. They became customers. The company that Max Keith had kept alive in Germany with his improvised Fanta was reabsorbed into the Coca-Cola empire almost immediately after the war. Keith handed over every asset, every profit, every trademark. The Atlanta headquarters, which had spent 4 years not knowing whether Keith was a loyal employee or a Nazi collaborator, sent investigators who confirmed his integrity. Keith had never joined a Nazi party. He had never enriched himself. He had protected the company's people and property through 6 years of total war. Pepsi-Cola, which had received no sugar exemption and no military bottling contracts, spent the next 2 decades trying to close the gap that the war had opened. The cola wars of the 1960s and 1970s were, in a very real sense, a belated competitive response to an advantage that Coca-Cola had secured in 1942. The advantage was not a better formula or a better advertising campaign. It was 64 bottling plants, built on the taxpayer's dime, in markets that Pepsi had never entered. Here is what the soldiers understood that the generals and the executives and the historians sometimes miss. A war is not fought for abstractions. It is not fought for democracy or freedom or the defeat of fascism. Not in the moment, not in the foxhole, not at 3 a.m. on a transport ship crossing the Atlantic. In the moment, a soldier fights for the man next to him, for the mail from home, for the promise of a warm meal and a cold drink and the possibility of surviving until tomorrow. Coca-Cola was not a weapon. It was not a strategic material. It did not harden armor or increase the range of a bomber or improve the accuracy of a naval gun. What it did was remind 16 million Americans in uniform that there was a home to go back to, and that the home they remembered, the soda fountains, the movie theaters, the Saturday afternoons, was still there, waiting for them. The soldiers who wrote home that they were fighting for the right to buy Coca-Cola were not being flippant. They were expressing in the only language available to a 20-year-old from Ohio or Texas or Alabama the truth that a war for grand principles is fought by individual human beings who need small, concrete, tangible things to hold on to. A bottle of Coca-Cola, cold, in the distinctive contour bottle that fit the hand, tasting exactly like it tasted at the drugstore back home. That was enough. That was the connection. That was the reason. The contour bottle itself deserves a word. Designed in 1915 by the Root Glass Company of Terre Haute, Indiana, it was intended to be recognizable by touch alone, so that a man could identify a Coca-Cola in the dark or by feeling it in a bucket of ice water without looking. During the war, that tactile familiarity became a form of emotional recognition. A soldier on Okinawa, reaching into a tub of ice and feeling the curved glass under his fingers, knew what he was touching before he saw it. The shape was home. The taste confirmed it. The numbers tell the story. 5 billion bottles consumed by military personnel, 64 bottling plants built in combat zones, 248 Coca-Cola employees deployed overseas, 148 granted technical observer status, 3 killed in the line of duty, 1,100 jungle fountains painted green for camouflage, deployed to Pacific Islands where no refrigeration existed and no road led to the nearest bottling plant. 1 telegram from the Supreme Allied Commander requesting 3 million bottles and 10 portable factories. 1 promise from a company president guaranteeing 5-cent Cokes to every man in uniform regardless of cost. 1 German businessman inventing a drink from cheese waste to keep the enemy's factories alive. 1 auction of a single bottle raising $6,000 for the orphans of the dead. 1 marshal of the Soviet Union drinking Coca-Cola disguised as vodka. And underneath all of this, beneath the logistics and the advertising and the corporate strategy and the geopolitical maneuvering, 16 million young Americans who wanted, more than almost anything else in the world, to drink a Coca-Cola and pretend for 30 seconds that they were home. The war ended. The soldiers came home. The bottling plants kept running. The Coca-Cola colonels took off their uniforms and went back to civilian life. Robert Woodruff continued to run the company for another decade. Eisenhower became president and kept drinking Coke. Fanta was reinvented in Italy with orange flavor and sold worldwide. The empire that the war built continued to expand until Coca-Cola became the most recognized brand on the planet, sold in more countries than belonged to the United Nations. But the foundation of that empire was not marketing genius or superior product formulation. It was the moment, repeated 5 billion times, when a soldier far from home tasted something familiar and felt for just a few seconds that the world he was fighting for still existed. That is what Coca-Cola was during the Second World War. Not a soft drink, a promise, a connection. a 6-ounce glass bottle of the country they were fighting to save. American soldiers said they were fighting for two things, their country and Coca-Cola. They were not joking, they meant it. And the company that heard them, that sent them 5 billion bottles, 64 factories, and 148 men in army uniforms whose only mission was to make sure no American soldier ever had to fight without one, understood that the joke was the truest thing anyone had said about what kept an army going. Not ammunition, not strategy, not grand alliances. A cold Coke, 5 cents, wherever you are, whatever it costs.